Asbestos is a group of rocks known for two main things. Asbestos rocks won't burn, but they're fibrous and can be spun into thread. Put those together and you get fireproof cloth that can protect you from flames or stamp out a fire. Today's artifact is an asbestos fire blanket holder. Welcome to Asbestos Artifacts, where we take a look at some old asbestos products and dig a little bit into the story behind them. I'm asbestos attorney Justinian Lane. One of the oldest uses of asbestos was to make fireproof cloth. Throughout the ancient world, asbestos cloth was used as a cremation shroud. The deceased body would burn to ashes, wrapped in an asbestos cloth that was left unharmed. In fact, asbestos cloth was usually made of chrysotile asbestos, known as white asbestos, so the cloth would be left gleaming white after the fire. Asbestos cloth was also used for tablecloths and napkins. They could be cleaned by throwing them in the fire and they would emerge unharmed and clean. So asbestos can be woven into a fireproof cloth, and this cloth was also used to protect people from being burned. If you saw the movie The Princess Bride, the heroes trick the bad guys into thinking they're magical by wearing an asbestos blanket doused with flames. And in one of our Asbestos Rewind videos, we showed you a Japanese fireman wearing an asbestos uniform to protect him from the flames. Okay, so that's asbestos. Now let's talk about asbestos fire blankets. Fire blankets have two main purposes. One, they're used to dampen and put out fires by denying them oxygen. Two, they're used to protect humans from being burned. Dampening fires with a cloth is an old technique, and in fact, sheep's wool is a natural flame retardant, meaning it helps slow fires from burning. Wool is difficult to ignite. It forms ash instead of dripping and spreading the fire, and its flame tends to burn itself out. That's what scientists call self-extinguishing. That said, even a wool blanket could only stop a small fire and actually risk fanning flames or spreading them around. But in the 1820s, there was a French chemist named Joseph-Louis Gay-Lussac who was pioneering all kinds of techniques for what's called applied chemistry, which means using chemistry to make all kinds of products and technology. Gay-Lussac discovered that using alum and ammonium created two kinds of salts that made fabric like wool more fire-resistant. Other chemicals were also developed and added, like dye, to the fabrics. So then in 1912, an inventor named Ephraim M. Bishop was granted a patent for a fire extinguisher, which was actually a fireproofing treated wool blanket to be used to smother flames. Based on our research, Mr. Bishop was the first to patent a fire blanket, and it seems like part of the reason it was granted was that his design included a little loop and hook mechanism at the top to hang up the blanket. And that little element is key to our asbestos artifact today. These days, it's easy to buy a fire extinguisher at any hardware store, and you can get a discount on your home or renter's insurance if you do. Chemical fire extinguishers had actually been around and patented since the 1800s. Emergency sprinklers were developed by the 1900s, but in those days they were expensive and most households just couldn't afford them. So fire blankets were pitched as a firefighting system that everyone could afford at home, and that meant it had to be readily available near the places that fires might start, like the kitchen. It also had to be out of the way and not easily removed in order to ensure that once it's installed, it'd be there when you need it. So Mr. Bishop's patent is pitched as accomplishing those goals. The blanket can be hung up near potential fire hazards, high up and out of the way, and the hook is designed to need considerable force to remove the blanket. It's the early version of in case of fire, break glass. Enter asbestos cloth. We mentioned earlier that fire blankets have two purposes. The first is to stamp out fires, but the second is to wrap around people and protect them from fire. This includes welders and other workers who are regularly exposed to fire and molten products that can easily splatter and spread. In fact, I have one client who told me a very memorable story. He was working in a refinery that had a fire, and this refinery made a lot of poisonous gases. This gentleman was surrounded by fire, the gases were coming right at him, and the only thing he could do to escape and get out with his life was he grabbed one of the asbestos fire blankets at the refinery, wrapped himself around it, and had to get down on the ground on his hands and knees and crawl out from all of the poisonous gases and all of the fire. So that asbestos fire blanket actually saved his life. Asbestos is one of the most fire-resistant materials known to humans, so asbestos fire blankets was a no-brainer. The initial concept was actually to wrap around a baby trapped inside a burning building for carrying it out. Knowing what we know now about asbestos, that it can cause breathing diseases and cancer decades after exposure, this may seem questionable. But at the time, the asbestos industry had not revealed all it knew about the health dangers of asbestos, so the concept was quickly applied to adults and firefighters as protection against flame. As we said earlier, there was a precedent for this. In fact, in the 1700s and 1800s, there were performers who wrapped themselves in asbestos clothing and walked through fires, carrying raw beefsteaks and emerging unscathed, but with the beef cooked. Asbestos fire blankets were effective, and they became a staple, not just in homes, but anywhere fire dangers existed. From factories to ships, to chemistry labs at schools, to military locations, these things were everywhere. But just like Mr. Bishop anticipated, fire blankets needed to be stored somewhere out of the way, but reliably on hand. And now we reach our artifact. It's a vintage 1960s military asbestos blanket holder. Like the blankets, these holders used to be as ubiquitous as fire extinguishers are today. Now, fortunately, this one doesn't have any remnants of a fire blanket because it was actually a brand new one that was never used. And it's good there's no remnants of asbestos because the problem with asbestos fire blankets is that they fray and they release asbestos fibers into the air. Asbestos fibers are tiny, sometimes microscopic, and once you inhale them, they embed into your lungs and your respiratory system, and decades later they can do terrible damage, like leading to breathing diseases and cancers like mesothelioma. If you swallow them in the air, they can cause or aggravate various digestive cancers. Now, we weren't able to learn a lot about the manufacturing of this particular fire blanket holder, except that it was made by a company that made firefighting equipment, and this particular model appears to have been used for military purposes. We think it was actually mounted in the hallways in ships and bolted into the wall for easy access. So like we said, asbestos fire blankets were placed on ships, in barracks and armories, anywhere that a fire might break out and need to be quickly extinguished. And like we were saying, asbestos fire blankets worked really well. The average house fire is about 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Asbestos has a melting point above 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's 1,482 degrees Celsius for our metric viewers. And in researching this video, we found a NASA report that proved it in an all too grim way. NASA's simulator chambers often operate with pure oxygen so the astronauts can see what it's like to breathe with all artificial oxygen. In one terrible incident, a worker was just changing a light bulb, but it sparked and caused a huge fire fed by that pure oxygen. The worker tried to put it out with a towel that burst into flames. Then he retrieved an asbestos fire blanket, probably from a holder very much like this one. Unfortunately, that particular asbestos blanket also had a sizing compound. Sizing is any kind of substance added to paper or cloth to basically coat and fill in the holes between the thread. The NASA report indicated that the oxygen content was so high that the sizing material caught fire. Fortunately, the attendants outside the simulation chamber were able to bring the oxygen back down, but the workers' hands were injured. Now, the thing is that the asbestos part of the blanket was left entirely unburned. So that's the truth. Asbestos blankets worked. But the problem is that they pose too much of a health danger to continue using them. The asbestos industry knew about it for decades. They ignored and even suppressed information they received from their own company doctors and scientists. That's why major asbestos fire blanket manufacturers like Asbestos and Raymark set up trusts designed to compensate people injured by asbestos. Now, a lot of people were exposed, not just firefighters, but welders, pipe fitters, chemistry lab techs, even a lot of restaurant workers. Anybody who worked around potential fires in those days was usually walking past these asbestos fire blanket holders all day. Sometime in the 1950s, fiberglass started to be used to make fire blankets. But fiberglass is not without its own set of issues. When the fiberglass particles get under the skin, they can be very irritating. But as the truth about the health dangers of asbestos came out, asbestos was eventually banned and replaced by other materials, including fiberglass. Most asbestos fire blankets are probably no longer in use, but authorities have warned that asbestos-lined blankets could still be on the market in other countries, and there may still be some lying around in homes and on job sites in the US. Just because the government chose to regulate the use of asbestos all those years ago doesn't mean the supply that was already out there simply vanished. Discarding these blankets has been their owner's sole responsibility, and there hasn't been much policing on that. So if you encounter an old fire blanket in an old building or garage or workshop, especially in an old fire blanket container like today's asbestos artifact, it's best to avoid it. There are actually laws about disposing of asbestos that vary by state, so the easiest thing to do is to have a professional remove it. And maybe buy a fire extinguisher. Thanks for watching Asbestos Artifacts. If you liked this video, please click like, follow, and subscribe to our channel, and if you have any questions about this or asbestos in general, put them in the comments and we'll try to answer them in another video. Asbestos was used in over 3,000 types of products, so we've got plenty of ground to cover. I'm asbestos attorney Justinian Lane. See you next time.